In the spring of 69 BC, a Roman army moved east toward a frontier that had never formed part of the original campaign. Its commander, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, had already spent years fighting Mithridates V of Pontus. His soldiers had marched across western Anatolia, endured difficult terrain, and watched a royal army weaken through hunger before breaking under Roman pressure. They had taken cities and driven Mithridates from his kingdom. The war, however, had not ended. Before we begin today's story, please let me know which city you are in and what you are currently doing. After all, it's fascinating to see how many people enjoy stories with the same theme as the one you like. Mithridates had escaped into Armenia, where he sought protection from his son-in-law Tigranes II. That flight changed the problem facing Lucullus. Capturing another Pontic fortress would achieve little while the king remained free. Mithridates had survived Roman victories before. After earlier defeats, he had found new allies, raised new troops, and returned to the field. Given enough time, he might do so again. Lucullus had learned to distinguish between the defeat of an army and the removal of the political conditions that allowed another army to be formed. The Euphrates now marked the limit of the campaign, as it had previously been understood. West of the river, Rome possessed allies, supply arrangements, and an established military presence. Beyond it lay a different political order. Armenia was not a Roman province. Tigranes was not a minor ruler who could be intimidated without consequence. He controlled the strongest kingdom in the region and used the title King of Kings. His authority reached from the Armenian highlands into northern Mesopotamia and toward the Mediterranean. Cities paid tribute to him. Local rulers acknowledged his supremacy. Envoys approached his court as they would the court of a great monarch. Crossing the river meant entering that system without knowing how quickly it would respond. Lucullus accepted the danger because waiting carried its own cost. If the Romans remained west of the Euphrates, Tigranes could continue sheltering Mithridates, while denying that Armenia had entered the war. The two kings would gain time to exchange information, gather troops, and decide where the next campaign would begin. Rome would then be forced to guard a long frontier, while Mithridates recovered beyond its reach. Speed offered Lucullus his best chance. Tigranes ruled an extensive realm, but the resources of that realm could not be assembled at once. Orders had to travel from the royal court to governors, dependent kings, and military commanders. Those authorities then had to gather soldiers, horses, food, and equipment before sending their contingents toward a common point. Once concentrated, such an army could be formidable. Before concentration, it existed mainly as a promise of future strength. Lucullus intended to move before that promise became a battlefield reality. The decision placed heavy demands on his own army. Every mile east made supply more difficult. Grain had to be bought, requisitioned, or captured. Pack animals needed fodder, and river crossings could delay the baggage train. Roads that appeared usable on a map might narrow in the hills or become impassable after rain. The local population could also remove livestock, conceal food, or avoid Roman patrols. Lucullus was moving beyond the coastal regions, where fleets and allied cities could support him. His army would depend increasingly on whatever it could carry, and whatever the surrounding country could provide. Movement therefore became a condition of survival. A force that kept advancing might seize supplies before they were removed. A force that stopped too long could consume its stores and find itself isolated. The Romans were not entering an empty borderland. They were approaching the political center of Tigranes' power at the moment when that power appeared most secure. For roughly 2 decades, the direction of the Armenian king's reign had been outward. He had extended his authority into Sophene, northern Mesopotamia, and Syria. Antioch, one of the great cities of the Hellenistic world, had come under his control. Dependent rulers sent tribute and troops. His court had grown accustomed to victories that brought new land and confirmed his position. Yet the empire was less uniform than its size suggested. Some territories had been conquered only recently. Others remained under local rulers whose loyalty depended on calculation rather than attachment. Cities that obeyed while Tigranes appeared invincible might reconsider their position after a serious defeat. Communities moved by force into royal foundations had even less reason to identify their future with the monarchy. Tigranes possessed wide authority, but that authority was not rooted equally in every region. Lucullus could not know where the weaknesses would first appear. He knew only that delay favoured the larger power. The Armenian court needed time to recognise the invasion, decide on a response, and turn distant obligations into a functioning army. The Roman commander needed to prevent that process from unfolding in an orderly way. The campaign became a contest between two different forms of strength. Tigranes possessed territory, prestige, wealth, and the ability to summon forces from across his realm. Lucullus commanded a smaller army that had campaigned together for years and could move before the Armenian system had fully reacted. Neither advantage guaranteed success. Tigranes could have avoided a major battle. He could have withdrawn supplies from the Roman route and ordered mounted troops to attack foraging parties. He could have left Lucullus before fortified cities, while distance and hunger weakened the invaders. Mithridates would later recommend a strategy close to this. Such a response would have placed pressure on the Roman army, without risking the main Armenian force. The difficulty was political. Avoiding battle meant allowing a foreign commander to advance through the king's lands and threaten his new capital. Tigranes ruled through reputation as well as force. Dependent kings and governors obeyed partly because they believed he could protect the political order over which he presided. If he allowed the Romans to remain near Tigranocerta without answering them, that belief might begin to weaken. When the legions crossed the Euphrates, this choice had not yet been made. The soldiers saw only the country ahead. Rome was far behind them, Mithridates remained out of reach, and the Armenian court had not yet understood how quickly the war was moving toward its centre. Tigranes II had ruled Armenia since the middle of the 90s BC. His position at the beginning of his reign had not been secure. The surviving tradition claims that he had spent time as a hostage at the Parthian court and recovered his throne only after surrendering territory. The details cannot be confirmed in full, but the account reflects Armenia's difficult position. The kingdom stood between larger powers and could not ignore changes in Parthia, Anatolia, or Syria. Tigranes built his power by taking advantage of weakness around him. The Seleucid kingdom was being damaged by dynastic conflict. Parthian authority in the west was uneven. Rome possessed growing influence in Anatolia, but its attention was repeatedly divided by wars and political struggles elsewhere. Tigranes expanded into regions where no stronger power could maintain firm control. He absorbed Sophene and extended his authority into northern Mesopotamia. Gordiane and Adiabene entered his political orbit, along with parts of Media Atropatene. During the 80s BC, Armenian influence reached Syria, and Antioch came under his rule. For a time, his dominions stretched from the Caspian region toward the Mediterranean. The title King of Kings expressed the political structure he had created. It belonged to a tradition in which one monarch stood above subordinate rulers who retained their own territories while acknowledging a superior authority. Tigranes also adopted forms of kingship familiar to the Hellenistic cities under his control. His coins carried Greek inscriptions. Greek performers and intellectuals appeared at court. His new capital bore his name, following the example of earlier dynasts who used urban foundations to make their rule visible. These influences existed together. Armenian nobles understood Tigranes as the ruler of an established kingdom. Iranian and Mesopotamian subjects recognized the title King of Kings. Greek cities encountered royal authority through coinage, theatres, administration, and court patronage. Religion followed a similar pattern. The Armenian monarchy had close ties to Iranian traditions, while Greek cults remained present in many cities. Local religious practice continued across the empire. Tigranes did not need every subject to worship in the same way. He needed cities, nobles, and dependent rulers to obey. The diversity of the realm generated considerable wealth. Northern Mesopotamia contained fertile districts and important roads. Syria connected the Armenian court to Mediterranean trade. Cities produced revenue through markets, workshops, and taxation. Dependent kings could provide tribute without requiring the crown to govern every district through Armenian officials. That arrangement reduced the burden of direct administration, but it also limited the depth of royal control. A ruler might send troops because refusal appeared dangerous, not because he trusted the king. A city might pay taxes while waiting for a chance to recover greater independence. Noble families could remain loyal as long as the existing balance of power favored obedience. Victory kept those relationships stable for much of Tigranes' reign. Each successful campaign confirmed the value of submission. New territory increased revenue, and increased revenue supported further expansion. The court received reports that strengthened its confidence in the king's position. A political system centered on personal supremacy could also interfere with the movement of unwelcome information. Officers had reasons to soften reports of failure. Officials who feared blame might describe an invasion as a raid or an organized advance as a temporary disturbance. The ancient account claims that Tigranes killed the first messenger who reported the Roman advance. Afterward, others became afraid to speak openly. The scene may have been shaped to illustrate the dangers of royal anger, but the underlying problem is credible. Bad news rarely disappears. It changes as it passes through people who fear the consequences of delivering it. A border commander reports that Roman troops have crossed. A superior reduces the urgency because he does not want to admit that the frontier was poorly defended. The next official adds uncertainty. By the time the report reaches the court, an invasion has become an incursion that may soon end on its own. The army continues moving, while the language used to describe it becomes less precise. Lucullus needed only a limited period of confusion. He did not intend to occupy every district of Armenia. His immediate purpose was to create a crisis that Tigranes could not leave unanswered. The most effective target was Tigranocerta. The city stood closer to the southern territories of the expanded kingdom than the older capital of Artaxata. Its exact location remains uncertain, but its political function is clearer. Tigranes had built it to serve as a center for the lands he had gained in Mesopotamia and Syria. The city contained a palace, a theatre, and substantial wealth. It was still developing when the Romans approached. Its population included people transferred from conquered regions, particularly Greek communities from Cappadocia and Cilicia. Population transfer was a familiar tool of ancient government. Moving artisans and merchants could accelerate the growth of a new capital. Removing communities from conquered districts could weaken local resistance. Bringing people closer to the court also made their labor, production, and property easier to control. The policy had an obvious weakness. A population moved by royal order did not automatically become loyal to the city it was required to inhabit. Tigranocerta grew quickly, but some of its residents had lost homes, property, and local connections in the process. They lived inside a royal foundation, whose prosperity rested partly on the disruption of their former communities. That history would matter once the monarchy could no longer guarantee protection. The city represented more than wealth or administration. It expressed the public meaning of Tigranes' rule. Its buildings, court, and transplanted population made the reach of the monarchy visible. The capital announced that Armenia had become the center of a wider imperial system. A Roman siege would turn that claim into a liability. Tigranes could withdraw from an exposed district without losing the kingdom. Abandoning the city that bore his name was more difficult. Dependent rulers would watch his response. So would Armenian nobles and the populations of recently conquered territories. The larger his reputation had become, the more expensive it was to avoid defending it. This pressure did not make a field battle militarily unavoidable. It made delay harder to explain. Mithridates could recommend patience because he had already survived the loss of armies and kingdoms. Tigranes had not yet been forced into that kind of war. He still ruled from a position of visible superiority. His authority depended partly on the expectation that threats would be answered before they reached the center of his power. Lucullus was about to test that expectation. The road to Tigranocerta began far to the west, in the long struggle between Rome and Mithridates V of Pontus. Mithridates ruled the southern coast of the Black Sea, and had spent much of his reign extending his influence across Anatolia. He also presented himself as a protector of Greek communities facing Roman control. By the time Lucullus took command in the east, Rome and Pontus had already fought 2 major wars. A third conflict opened in 74 BC after the death of Nicomedes IV of Bithynia, who left his kingdom to Rome. Roman possession of Bithynia threatened the western approaches to Pontus, and Mithridates chose war rather than accept the change. The opening stages showed that he remained dangerous. Roman forces suffered reverses, cities came under siege, and the king again drew on the military resources of the Black Sea region. Lucullus changed the course of the war without giving Mithridates the battle he wanted. At Cyzicus, the Roman commander concentrated on supply rather than spectacle. The larger Pontic army remained in the field, but food became scarce. Sickness spread, and winter made movement harder. Its size, which had looked like an advantage, increased the amount of grain, fodder, and transport required each day. The lesson stayed with Lucullus. Enemy strength did not always have to be met at its strongest point. A commander could instead attack the condition that allowed that strength to function. Roman forces captured important cities and defeated further armies. By 71 BC, the king could no longer hold his position and sought refuge with Tigranes. The 2 rulers were connected by marriage. Tigranes had married Cleopatra, one of Mithridates' daughters, and the alliance had served both dynasties during earlier struggles in Cappadocia. Their interests were never identical. However, Mithridates had committed himself to repeated wars against Rome, while Tigranes had directed most of his expansion towards Syria and northern Mesopotamia, where Seleucid weakness offered greater rewards at lower risk. Mithridates therefore arrived in Armenia as a royal relative and a defeated ally. The surviving account suggests that Tigranes kept him at a distance for months, rather than welcoming him immediately into the center of court. The exact treatment is uncertain, but the tension is easy to understand. Giving refuge did not require Tigranes to accept the full burden of Mithridates' war. Handing him over to Rome would still have been difficult. Mithridates was the father of Tigranes' wife, and a king who had entered Armenia under royal protection. If Tigranes surrendered him at the demand of a foreign general, dependent rulers could question whether Armenian protection had any practical value. The act would also concede that Rome could dictate terms inside the king's own territory. Tigranes may also have doubted Rome's ability to sustain a campaign so far inland. Lucullus' soldiers had already served for years. Roman commands were vulnerable to political change, and rivals in the Senate could remove a general before his military work was finished. From the Armenian court, refusal may have looked less like a declaration of war than a decision to preserve dignity until the immediate danger passed. Lucullus saw no safe distinction between refuge and renewed resistance. Mithridates had rebuilt his position after previous defeats and still possessed supporters around the Black Sea. Time at a friendly court could give him the opportunity to gather money, establish contact with allies, and organize another army. The Roman commander sent Appius Claudius Pulcher to demand his surrender. The message was severe, but its legal and political setting remained uncertain. Rome had not formally declared war on Armenia. If Tigranes complied, Lucullus could claim that the existing conflict had been brought to an end without opening another. If he refused, that refusal could be treated as active protection of Rome's enemy. Appius was a young aristocrat connected to Lucullus by marriage. The surviving narratives describe him speaking with unusual directness at the Armenian court and declining the gestures of submission expected before the King of Kings. Some of the detail may reflect Roman admiration for republican bluntness, but the disagreement itself is clear. Tigranes expected the standing of a great monarch to be recognized. Appius arrived from a political culture in which Roman commanders had grown accustomed to presenting Eastern rulers with demands rather than requests. The form of the audience therefore mattered almost as much as the subject under discussion. For Lucullus, Mithridates was a defeated enemy who had to be surrendered. For Tigranes, he was a royal relative under protection. Neither position allowed much room for a settlement that preserved the status of both sides. The private arguments at court have not survived. No record reveals whether Tigranes thought Lucullus would actually cross the frontier, or whether he expected Roman politics to end the threat. The decision is known. Mithridates would remain in Armenia. War did not become inevitable at the exact moment of refusal. There were still possible delays, further messages, or an informal compromise. Rome and Armenia lacked any permanent machinery for handling such a crisis, though the relationship rested on envoys' reputation and the force each ruler believed the other was willing to use. Once the demand had been rejected, Lucullus faced a practical choice. He could accept that his authority stopped at the Armenian frontier and leave Mithridates beyond reach, or he could cross that frontier and force the issue. He chose the second course. Appius Claudius had reached the Armenian court before the invasion began in 69 BC. His journey already carried an implied warning. A Roman officer had entered the realm of Tigranes and obtained an audience. Yet the army behind his message still remained outside Armenia. Courtesy and threat occupied the same room, and events had not yet decided which would matter more. The audience is remembered as a clash of political habits. Appius spoke plainly and refused to behave as a subordinate before the King of Kings. Tigranes listened, rejected the demand, and allowed the envoy to leave. Later retellings sharpened the contrast between Roman confidence and royal ceremony. But the central exchange does not depend on the dramatic detail. Lucullus demanded Mithridates. Tigranes refused. That answer changed the position of both rulers. Tigranes had defended royal dignity, but he had also accepted responsibility for the continued safety of Mithridates. Lucullus now possessed a reason to carry the war into Armenia. If he issued such a demand and then stopped at the frontier, allies who had supported the Roman campaign might conclude that his reach had been exaggerated. The late Roman Republic often gave commanders broad room to act before clear instructions arrived from Rome. Messages to the Senate took time, and political rivals could use that delay to reduce a command or transfer it to someone else. Lucullus had already antagonized influential financial interests in Asia. By limiting the profits they could extract from provincial debt, he could not rely on automatic approval once his decisions were reviewed at home. These pressures encouraged speed, but they did not make the invasion safe. Armenia's interior lay beyond the coastal regions, where Roman fleets and allied ports could support an army. Supplies would have to move overland, through districts whose loyalty was uncertain. If Tigranes declined battle and withdrew food from the Roman route, Lucullus might spend months trying to sustain a force that had no secure base nearby. The failed embassy narrowed the range of choices. Each ruler now acted on an assumption about what the other would have to do to preserve authority. Lucullus believed that Tigranes could not allow a Roman army to threaten Tigranocerta without responding. Tigranes appears to have believed that no Roman commander would risk moving so deeply into Armenia with a relatively small force. Both assumptions contain some truth. Neither could be tested without danger. The best known story about the opening of the invasion concerns a messenger who brought news of the Roman advance and was killed for delivering it. Later reports then became cautious or delayed because officials feared the same fate. The scene cannot be verified in its precise form. But the larger problem does not require a dramatic execution. Information in a large court passed through several hands. A border officer might hesitate to admit that an enemy had crossed under his watch. A superior could reduce the urgency before forwarding the report. The next official might add uncertainty to protect himself from blame. By the time the message reached the king, an organized invasion could be described as a raid or a temporary incursion. Lucullus benefited from any delay of that kind. He did not need to conquer Armenia province by province. He needed to reach a place whose danger would force the king to act. Tigranocerta offered exactly that pressure point. It was the new capital of the Southern Empire, the city that gave permanent form to Tigranes' recent victories. It also served Lucullus' pursuit of Mithridates. If Tigranes remained passive, he risked losing the city. If he moved to defend it, the Romans might gain the open battle that Mithridates had good reason to avoid. The Roman army could not remain in Armenia indefinitely. It did not have to. Lucullus needed only enough time to make the Armenian response predictable. Tigranes still possessed alternatives. He could remove the royal household and treasury, strip the surrounding country of food, and use cavalry to follow the Roman column without offering battle. A retreat toward the highlands would allow distance, weather, and supply shortages to work against the invaders. Militarily, such a strategy had merit. Politically, it demanded that the king accept the sight of an enemy army near the city that carried his name. That cost mattered, because Tigranes ruled through subordinate kings, governors, and local dynasts. Their obedience depended partly on his ability to protect the order from which their own positions came. If Tigranocerta fell without a serious attempt at relief, some might decide that neutrality, negotiation with Rome, or open resistance had become safer than loyalty. The capital was unfinished, but its political message was already complete. Its palace, theatre, walls, and transferred population announced that Armenia had moved beyond the scale of a regional kingdom. A siege would make the same city evidence of the monarchy's limits. Lucullus did not need to occupy every part of the empire. He needed to expose the connection between its authority and its reputation. Tigranes did not need to lose all his territory to suffer a major political defeat. A visible failure before the rulers who had joined him because he seemed unbeatable could be enough. The envoy had returned, the demand had failed, and the frontier had been crossed. The next stage depended on pace. Lucullus had to reach the capital before Tigranes could turn the full reach of his kingdom into a concentrated army. Lucullus entered Armenia with an army already worn down by years of campaigning. The exact strength at the start of the invasion cannot be recovered with confidence, because the surviving accounts count heavy infantry, cavalry, and light troops at different stages. The main body probably included about 12,000 heavy infantry, supported by several thousand cavalrymen and lighter troops. When the battle near Tigranocerta finally took place, this was not a large imperial army advancing against a weak neighbour. Lucullus had fewer men than he would have chosen for a deep invasion, and every detachment made the field force smaller. His advantage lay elsewhere. He was moving, while the military resources of Tigranes' empire were still dispersed. The route carried the Romans through Sophene, a region that had once been a separate kingdom before Tigranes absorbed it. Between Cappadocia, the Euphrates, and the southern approaches to Armenia, Sophene offered the most direct corridor. The frontier was not defended by a major royal army, and local knowledge helped the Roman column move through country that was unfamiliar to most of its soldiers. The first serious Armenian response came under Mithridates, one of Tigranes' trusted commanders. He was sent with cavalry to halt the invasion and was defeated. Few details of the encounter survive, but its effect was immediate. The Romans had not only crossed the border, they had destroyed the force ordered to drive them back. Tigranes could no longer treat the advance as a passing disturbance. He left Tigranocerta and moved toward the Taurus region, where a larger army could be assembled. Given the speed of the invasion, withdrawal was a sensible decision. Troops were scattered across a wide realm, and the king needed time to call them in, move the royal household, and organize the defense of the capital. Lucullus worked to deny him that time. Murena was sent against forces moving toward the king, while Sextilius operated against another body of troops, approaching the concentration area. The surviving narratives describe Roman attacks on columns caught in difficult ground. Their value did not lie only in the casualties they caused. Each delay disrupted the schedule on which Tigranes depended. A very large army was not created the moment the king issued an order. Messages had to reach provincial commanders and dependent rulers. Those men then had to collect soldiers, arrange supplies, and move separate contingents toward the same destination. Until the process was complete, the army existed in fragments. Lucullus attacked the process rather than waiting for the finished result. His advance forced Tigranes to manage several problems at once. The king had to gather troops, secure roads, protect the royal family, reassure subordinate rulers, and respond to the siege of a city that embodied his authority. The defeat of the first Armenian detachment also had to be explained or reversed before it damaged confidence further. Roman marching practice helped maintain the pressure. Legionaries were accustomed to organizing baggage, fortifying camps, and moving in units that could be redirected without falling apart. None of this protected them from hunger, fatigue, or bad roads. It did give Lucullus a force that could continue operating after a long march and could detach troops without losing all cohesion. The geography imposed its own limits. River valleys, ridges, and seasonal routes shaped movement through the southern Armenian highlands. The precise road followed by the Roman army cannot be reconstructed because the location of Tigranocerta remains uncertain. The broader problem is clear enough. Lucullus was leaving the coastal supply network behind. While Armenian and allied contingents were moving through restricted approaches from Mesopotamia and the plateau, Tigranes remained capable of assembling a much larger force. His withdrawal from the capital was not an abandonment of the war. It was an attempt to turn scattered obligations into an army that could remove the invaders. Cavalry could be called from Armenia and Media. Infantry came from subject territories. Dependent kings and allied rulers sent their own contingents. Once gathered, the host would exceed the Roman army in visible scale. Lucullus therefore had to decide the timing and location of the confrontation before the coalition settled into a stable position. Tigranocerta gave him a way to do that. A mobile enemy could retreat, change routes, or refuse contact. A capital could not. By moving against the city, Lucullus fixed the campaign around a place Tigranes could abandon only at serious political cost. The king had to defend it, attempt to relieve it, or accept its loss. The first Roman troops reached the area before the field army had returned. Lucullus began the investment and continued to send detachments against forces moving through the region. The city came under pressure, while many people in the wider empire were still adjusting to the fact that a Roman army had crossed the Euphrates at all. From the walls, residents could see camps taking shape and soldiers working along the approaches. Farther away, messengers rode toward Tigranes and the contingents gathering around him. The capital had been built to display control over a broad realm. It now became the point where that control would be tested. The city known in Greek as Tigranocerta and in Armenian as Tigranocerta was one of several foundations that carried the name of Tigranes. The capital attacked by Lucullus stood somewhere in the southern part of the kingdom, though its exact location remains disputed. Several modern sites have been proposed, and none has settled the question beyond doubt. The narrative of the campaign is therefore clearer than the map on which it unfolded. The surviving descriptions agree that the city was wealthy and still relatively new. It contained strong defences, a royal palace, gardens, and a theatre. Tigranes intended it to serve as the centre of his enlarged southern empire. Artaxata, the older capital, lay farther north near the Armenian heartland. Tigranocerta faced the regions that had brought the king much of his new revenue and political reach. Its value was administrative as well as military. Officials gathered there. Taxes and tribute could be received. And royal ceremony made the hierarchy of the empire visible. The city also stood on routes, linking Armenia with northern Mesopotamia and Syria, giving it a commercial role in addition to its function as a court. Tigranocerta reflected the different traditions present in the kingdom. A Greek theatre formed part of a capital, ruled by a monarch who wore an Iranian-style tiara and called himself King of Kings. Greek remained important in urban life and at court. Armenian nobles formed the political core of the monarchy, while communities from Mesopotamia brought their own languages and institutions. The population also revealed the coercion behind the project. Tigranes had transferred people from conquered regions, especially Greek communities from Cappadocia and Cilicia. Other groups were settled there as well. Claims that entire cities were emptied cannot be checked in detail. But forced movement formed a real part of the capital's growth. Such transfers served practical purposes. Artisans and merchants could make a new city productive within a short period. Removing people from recently conquered districts weakened local resistance. Concentrating population and wealth near the royal court also made both easier to observe and tax. For those who were moved, the policy meant the loss of homes, property, and local ties. A royal grant of housing did not turn an imposed residence into a chosen homeland. When Roman troops appeared outside the walls, many residents had little reason to risk their lives for the dynasty that had brought them there. The garrison's position was different. Soldiers depended on pay, discipline, and the expectation that the king would relieve them. Even so, the city should not be divided too neatly into loyal defenders and secret Roman supporters. People adjusted their choices as the siege developed. Groups that cooperated during ordinary life could turn against one another once survival, wages, and the outcome of the war became uncertain. Tigranocerta was still being completed. Performers had reportedly gathered for the dedication of the theatre, a detail that captures the awkward timing of the invasion. The court was preparing to present the city as a finished expression of royal achievement when Roman camps appeared outside it. The walls gave the defenders real protection. Their precise dimensions are uncertain, and ancient measurements should not be treated as an engineer's survey. Even so, Lucullus could not take the city at once. The investment forced him to leave troops behind, which reduced the army available when Tigranes approached. The political effect of the siege worked in the opposite direction. Each day that Roman troops remained outside the capital made the invasion harder to dismiss. Dependent rulers assembling under Tigranes were no longer coming merely to protect a distant frontier. They had been summoned to rescue the king's own foundation. The city also held royal wealth. Treasure stored there could pay troops, reward allies, and support further campaigns. In Roman hands, the same resources would enrich the army and help finance continued operations. Tigranocerta was therefore important for reasons that went well beyond symbolism. Lucullus did not need to breach the walls immediately. The siege only had to remain credible. If Tigranes believed the city safe, he could delay and attack Roman supply lines. If he believed the capital was in danger, he would be drawn toward the plain. At Cyzicus, Lucullus had used time against an army. Here he used a threatened city against a king. Tigranes' empire was too large for the Romans to pursue in every direction. But the capital fixed his attention in one place. Life inside the walls gradually narrowed around the siege. Markets depended on stored food, and whatever could still enter. Officials tried to maintain order. Soldiers watched the Roman positions, and residents waited for news of the field army. Outside, the Romans established camps and controlled the most useful approaches. The surviving evidence does not justify detailed scenes of particular engines striking named towers on specific days. Roman troops certainly had engineering experience, and the city was under active pressure. That is enough to explain the decision that followed. Tigranes could not allow the siege to continue without response. Only part of Lucullus's army remained around Tigranocerta. The force was too small to seal a large city with an unbroken line. But it could occupy important roads, threaten movement, and make entry or departure dangerous. The arrangement left the Romans exposed in two directions. The defenders might attempt a sortie from behind the walls, while Tigranes' relief army approached from outside. Lucullus had to keep enough men near the city to preserve the pressure that had drawn the king there. Yet he also needed a field force capable of surviving the coming battle. Either choice carried risk. If the army facing Tigranes was defeated, the siege troops could be trapped. If too many men stayed at the walls, Lucullus would confront a much larger enemy, with a force reduced below an already modest strength. He accepted both dangers because lifting the siege would remove the reason Tigranes had to fight. The king had practical reasons to come, whatever role pride played in his decision. The loss of Tigranocerta would damage revenue, royal prestige, and the loyalty of dependent rulers. The city also held members of the royal household and valuable property, though some were removed before the final confrontation. Armenian troops managed to carry women of the royal family and part of the treasure out of the city, which shows that the Roman investment was never completely sealed. Lucullus continued to interfere with the gathering army. Detachments threatened roads and attacked reinforcements. A delayed contingent meant fewer troops available on the decisive day, but delay also had a political effect. Vassals who struggled to reach the king might begin to question whether the coalition could protect them on the march or coordinate them after arrival. Inside Tigranocerta, the progress of the relief army shaped every calculation. The garrison could remain confident while Tigranes appeared undefeated. The transferred population had less straightforward motives. Some residents may have wanted a quick Armenian victory, simply because it promised an end to the siege. Others saw Roman success as a possible route back to the cities from which they had been removed. Waiting imposed costs on the Romans as well. A siege camp consumed food at a steady rate. Soldiers spent their days digging, guarding, patrolling, and watching for attacks. Crowded conditions increased the danger of disease. The main bases of Roman power remained far to the west, and the arrival of the king's army could change the situation within hours. Lucullus' force included allied cavalry and light troops as well as legionaries. Rome did not fight with heavy infantry alone. The important difference was that these elements had marched and campaigned together under one command. Their cooperation was not perfect, but it had been tested before they reached Tigranocerta. The coalition gathering around Tigranes was serving a second purpose. Its size was meant to reverse the political shock of the invasion. Dependent kings arrived with their own contingents and displayed their obedience in armed form. From the royal camp, the empire could be seen assembled across the landscape. Confidence in such circumstances was not irrational. Tigranes possessed the larger army, cavalry, familiar territory, and a Roman enemy divided between the city and the field. Later accounts portray the Armenian camp as filled with boasts and contempt. Those scenes were probably sharpened after the defeat, but most commanders looking at the same advantages would have expected success. Mithridates was less certain. He had watched Lucullus avoid a direct contest at Cyzicus and turn a larger army's appetite against it. His advice was to refuse battle, use cavalry against Roman supplies, and let distance weaken the invaders. The proposal addressed the weakest point in Lucullus' position. A small army far from secure bases could be forced to retreat without a dramatic victory. Roads could be threatened, grain removed, and foraging parties attacked. Tigranocerta might suffer under the siege, but time could make the Roman camp suffer more. Tigranes did not reject the idea simply because he lacked patience. Following it would mean leaving the capital under pressure, while the ruler of Armenia adopted the defensive advice of a fugitive who had already been beaten by the same Roman commander. It also required feeding a large coalition for an uncertain period. Horses consumed vast amounts of fodder, troops needed grain and water, and dependent rulers might not remain indefinitely. The king had summoned them to defend the center of his power. If he now avoided battle while the siege continued, some might read caution as weakness. A coalition is hard to hold together when its members begin to suspect that the leader cannot protect his own capital. By the time Tigranes moved toward Tigranocerta, Lucullus had already achieved the main purpose of the siege. The king was making a military decision under political pressure and had chosen to rely on the visible strength of his assembled army. From the walls, the approaching host must have looked like relief. The Roman camp appeared small beside it. Tigranes could now see the invaders who had entered his realm and threatened his foundation. Lucullus could see the army he had spent the campaign trying to bring within reach. Drawing it into the field had been difficult. Fighting it would be harder. The army that Tigranes brought toward Tigranocerta was much larger than the force facing it, but the exact difference cannot be measured. Ancient accounts give totals that rise into the hundreds of thousands, including enormous bodies of infantry, cavalry, archers, attendants, and labourers. Those figures were written to magnify the Roman victory, and do not read like the product of a reliable census. Armies in the ancient world were often estimated from appearance, rumour, or claims made by commanders. Victors had every reason to enlarge the host they had defeated. The practical limits are equally important. Feeding hundreds of thousands of people and tens of thousands of horses in one area would have required a supply system on an exceptional scale. The evidence supports a firmer, but less dramatic conclusion. Tigranes had assembled an army considerably larger than Lucullus's field force. It included Armenian troops and contingents connected with Media Atropatene, Adiabene, Gordiane, and other territories within the king's sphere. Arab forces are mentioned, along with troops associated with Iberia and Albania. Those units did not all stand in the same relationship to Tigranes. Some came from lands under direct control. Others followed dependent kings, who retained their own courts and military households. A few rulers may have joined, because they had benefited from Armenian expansion. Others probably came, because refusing the summons still seemed more dangerous than obeying it. The size of the army made coordination a serious task. Commanders had to agree on positions, signals, and the order in which units would move. Contingents that had marched under their own officers now had to fit into a common plan. A formation could appear settled from a distance, while the chain of command remained slow once circumstances changed. The most famous element was the heavily armoured cavalry, known as cataphracts. Equipment varied, but both rider and horse could be protected by scale or lamellar armour. The rider carried a long lance intended to deliver a powerful blow in a charge. On open ground, with enough room to form and accelerate, such cavalry posed a severe threat to infantry that lost cohesion. Tigranes also possessed large bodies of infantry. Some may have used formations influenced by Hellenistic practice, while others fought with equipment common to their own regions. Archers and slingers provided missile support. The coalition was not simply an untrained crowd, even though Roman accounts sometimes reduced it to one. Its greatest visible advantage was the amount of ground it covered. A broad line could extend beyond the Roman flanks. Reserves gave the centre depth, and missile troops could make a direct approach costly. If Lucullus moved straight into that formation, numbers might absorb the initial attack before the Romans achieved anything decisive. He therefore needed to prevent Tigranes from using the whole army at once. Time also mattered. A prolonged standoff would allow more troops to arrive and would increase pressure on Roman supplies. Lucullus had drawn the king into the field, but he could not let the confrontation settle into a contest of endurance. Tigranes appears to have trusted the sight of his army. A famous remark credits him with saying that the Romans were too many to be ambassadors and too few to be soldiers. The line may have been polished in later retelling, yet it captures the impression before him. The Roman force looked too small for the task it had chosen. Part of Lucullus's army remained at the siege. The force advancing toward Tigranes probably included around 10,000 heavy infantry, with cavalry, archers, and slingers bringing the total higher. Even after setting aside the most inflated Armenian numbers, the imbalance was substantial. The king stood in the centre of his deployment, while allied rulers commanded the wings. The kings of Adiabene and Media are associated with positions on either side. Mail-clad cavalry occupied important ground near a height, though the exact shape of the line cannot be reconstructed, because the battlefield itself has not been identified securely. The deployment faced the plain and the river from which the Romans were expected to approach. It assumed that Lucullus would have to come forward under the weight of superior numbers. The Armenian wings could then threaten his flanks, while the centre held him in place. That assumption affected the meaning of every movement the Romans made. A withdrawal seemed sensible. A direct attack appeared unreasonable. Tigranes could see the Roman troops clearly, but the scale of his own army influenced what he believed they were capable of attempting. Lucullus had already seen how size could distort judgment. At Cyzicus, Mithridates' army looked powerful because it was large, yet that same size made it difficult to feed. Near Tigranocerta, the coalition's scale created confidence and made a sudden change of direction harder to organize. Neither weakness guaranteed defeat. Both could be exploited if the Romans moved at the right moment. The army on the field was intended to show that the authority of the King of Kings remained intact. It also revealed the practical limits of that authority. Orders still had to pass through commanders, messengers, and formations spread across a wide space. On the eve of battle, Tigranes held the obvious advantage. Lucullus had one useful chance left. He had to make the larger army respond to something it had not prepared to see. Mithridates understood that danger better than most of the men in the Armenian camp. He had watched Lucullus refuse an attractive battle, preserve his own army, and wait until a larger enemy could no longer sustain itself. His advice was to avoid a general engagement. The alternative was a campaign against movement and supply. Cavalry could harass foraging parties, threaten messengers, and force every convoy to travel under guard. Food could be removed from districts near the Roman route. Roads and crossings could be blocked. Under steady pressure, Lucullus might have to abandon the siege or divide his army again. A commander connected with Mithridates reportedly argued along similar lines. Tigranes may initially have listened. As more contingents arrived, however, battle appeared safer and delay less necessary. Each new column strengthened the impression that the problem could be settled in the field. Royal pride played a part, but it does not explain the decision by itself. Tigranes had called dependent rulers to defend a capital that represented his supremacy. Keeping them in camp while the Romans continued the siege created new difficulties. The coalition had to be fed, and some of its members might leave or begin private negotiations if the campaign dragged on. A large army consumed resources even in friendly territory. Horses required fodder every day. Infantry needed grain, water, space, and transport. Camp followers increased the total burden. Tigranes could not continue gathering forces indefinitely without deciding how to use them. The social structure of the host also favoured visible action. Kings and aristocrats had arrived with their own households, reputations, and expectations. They were not anonymous officers who could be ordered to wait without political consequence. Many expected a place in a victory that seemed certain from the size of the armies. Tigranocerta added urgency. It was not an old fortress whose temporary loss could easily be explained. The city was the king's own foundation, and a public statement about the reach of his reign. Every day of siege made that statement less convincing. Mithridates had learned to place survival above appearance. He had lost armies and territory before, and had continued the war. Tigranes still ruled from the height of his power. His system depended on hierarchy expansion, and the expectation that others approached him as petitioners. The invasion forced him into the unfamiliar position of defending the southern centre of his own empire. Later narratives describe an Armenian camp filled with contempt for the Romans and competition over who would defeat them. Such scenes were likely sharpened after the event. But confidence itself needs no invention. Tigranes had the larger force, familiar ground, strong cavalry, and an opponent whose army was divided between the siege and the field. Lucullus faced a difficult choice of his own. Some officers favoured lifting the siege and bringing every available soldier against Tigranes. Others feared leaving the defenders free to move behind them. He chose to maintain both operations. Murena remained at Tigranocerta with 6,000 infantry. while Lucullus led the rest toward the king. The decision preserved the pressure that had brought Tigranes to the battlefield. If the siege ended, the king could claim that the capital had been relieved without accepting battle. If too many Romans stayed behind, however, the field army might be crushed. Lucullus took 24 cohorts, amounting to no more than about 10,000 heavy infantry, together with cavalry and light troops. The exact total matters less than the choice. He advanced against a host several times larger, while keeping a substantial detachment at the city. The battle was fought on the 6th of October, 69 BC, according to the surviving chronology. A later story has an officer warning Lucullus that the date carried an unlucky association from an earlier Roman disaster. The commander answered that he would make it fortunate. Whether or not the exchange occurred exactly that way, soldiers did pay attention to omens, anniversaries, and the confidence of their general. Lucullus could not persuade his men that the enemy was small. He could give them a plan that kept the larger army from acting together. The result would depend on whether the Romans reached a vulnerable part of the Armenian position before Tigranes understood what they were doing. The king had chosen battle. Lucullus now had to make movement more useful than mass. The battlefield lay close to Tigranocerta and included a river, a plain, and nearby high ground. Because the city itself has not been located with certainty, the river cannot be identified beyond doubt. The safest reconstruction follows the relationship between the terrain features, rather than attaching the battle to a precise modern map. Tigranes' army stood across the water from the Romans. A hill or elevated area formed part of the Armenian position, and mail-clad cavalry held ground connected with it. The line faced the plain where Lucullus seemed likely to advance. From the Armenian side, the morning must have looked reassuring. The coalition filled a broad space, while the Roman line appeared narrow. The difference was visible before either army moved, and reinforced the expectation that Lucullus would hesitate or retreat. He did neither in the obvious way. Instead of approaching the Armenian centre, the Romans marched along the river toward a bend or ford. Seen from the far side, the movement resembled withdrawal. The smaller army appeared to be turning away from the confrontation and looking for a safe route out. Tigranes seems to have read it that way. The conclusion was reasonable. A force facing a much larger enemy often seeks a crossing before retreating, and the Roman column was following the bank rather than threatening the main line. Lucullus did not conceal his troops. He allowed the Armenian commanders to watch them while drawing the wrong conclusion from what they saw. Tigranes did not have to be foolish. He only had to accept the explanation that looked most probable. The Romans reached the ford and crossed. Lucullus placed himself near the front, where he could observe the passage and keep the movement from slowing. Crossing a river before a larger enemy was dangerous. An attack during the passage could split the column and leave troops isolated on opposite banks. The gamble depended on two things. The Armenians had to continue believing that the Romans were leaving, and the Roman units had to recover their formation quickly after the crossing. Once across, the column changed direction. Rather than continuing away, it turned toward the high ground, linked to the Armenian cavalry. Only then did the movement reveal itself as an attack. Recognition did not produce an instant response. Orders had to pass from Tigranes to the commanders on the wing. Units already deployed across a wide area had to change facing or adjust their position. A smaller force under a single command could redirect itself faster than a coalition spread across the field. The Roman maneuver also avoided the strongest part of the Armenian plan. A direct approach toward the centre would have exposed Lucullus to missile fire and cavalry moving around the flanks. By turning toward the height, he aimed at one section of the army before the rest could support it. The surviving accounts describe surprise in the Armenian command when the direction became clear. The exact words attributed to Tigranes cannot be confirmed, but the delay fits the situation. The army had been arranged for a Roman advance across the plain. It now had to respond to an attack developing from a different angle. Thracian and Gallic cavalry were sent toward the flank of the cataphracts, while Lucullus led 2 cohorts toward the hill. From there, the Romans could threaten the side or rear of the armoured horsemen. The height was not an impossible obstacle. Its importance came from direction and timing. Heavy cavalry required space to face the enemy, preserve intervals, and build momentum for a charge. An attack from higher ground or from an unexpected angle forced the riders to turn before they could use the length and weight of their lances. Lucullus ordered a quick approach so that Armenian archers had less time to shoot effectively. The infantry still had to preserve order. Speed did not mean a wild rush. It meant reaching the decisive ground before the wing completed its adjustment. By then, the battle was unfolding differently for each part of the field. Tigranes saw a Roman force changing direction across a broad landscape. The cataphracts saw infantry approaching ground they had not expected to defend. The Armenian centre waited for a clear explanation of what was happening on the wing. Tigranes still had more men. The Roman movement had begun to keep those men from acting as one army. Lucullus moved toward the height with 2 cohorts, while other Roman troops kept pressure on the Armenian cavalry from another direction. Later tradition places the commander at the front of the climb and has him declare that victory was already within reach once he gained the summit. The wording is impossible to verify, but the sequence is consistent. The Romans reached the high ground and threatened the mail, clad horsemen from a direction for which they had not prepared. Modern retellings sometimes turn the attack into a detailed lesson in cutting horses, striking armor joints, or finding exposed limbs. The surviving narrative is less specific. Lucullus is said to have pointed to the legs and thighs of the riders as vulnerable areas. Yet the cavalry began to give way before a prolonged close fight developed. The outcome did not depend on a secret method for defeating armor. It came from disorder, created before the cataphracts could use their equipment properly. They were trying to change position and direction, while Roman infantry closed from an unexpected angle. Heavy cavalry remained one of the most effective arms in the region and would continue to matter for centuries. Armor protected the rider and increased the force of a charge. It also made formation, spacing, and direction especially important. When those conditions failed, much of the advantage disappeared. The cavalry was not isolated from the rest of Tigranes' army. Infantry and other units occupied ground nearby, limiting the space available for a turn or withdrawal. The slope added another constraint. Once the forward ranks began to move back, riders behind them had to respond without seeing the full situation. The decisive moment came when retreating cavalry entered the space of the Armenian infantry, before that infantry had properly engaged. A force intended to protect the wing became an obstacle inside the larger formation. The breakdown probably did not happen everywhere at once. Some groups may have resisted while others turned. Messages would have reached commanders at different times. Soldiers in the centre could not immediately know whether the movement on the wing was an ordered redeployment, a temporary setback, or a defeat. That uncertainty favoured the Romans. A large army can recover from a local failure if reserves receive clear orders and commanders understand the scale of the problem. Tigranes' coalition had little time to interpret what was happening. The battle had departed from the plan around which the entire deployment had been arranged. Lucullus' smaller force remained focused on a limited objective. The Armenian command had to protect a broad front, coordinate several contingents, and prevent withdrawing cavalry from disrupting nearby infantry. Reserves were available, but they had not yet been directed toward a solution. The cataphracts also carried psychological weight. They were among the most visible and heavily equipped troops on the field. Other soldiers expected them to break the Roman formation. Watching them move backward suggested that the part of the army considered strongest had failed before the main infantry line had been tested. Information moved slowly across an ancient battlefield. Dust, uneven ground, and distance reduced visibility. Messengers and signals helped, but no commander possessed a complete view. Rumour often reached soldiers before an accurate order did. Retreating cavalry created a form of information that could not be ignored. Infantry facing forward might first hear horses approaching from the side or rear. Men turned to look, and their own alignment began to loosen. If the riders entered their space, the infantry had to open ranks or be pushed aside. Either response reduced cohesion. The Roman success developed through this sequence, rather than through a single collision with the entire Armenian army. One part of the coalition lost order, then carried that disorder into the next. The contrast in numbers can hide the mechanism. Tigranes may have had many more soldiers, but most never received a useful opportunity to employ their weapons. They were defeated first as members of a formation that lost direction, not as individuals overcome in equal combat. The king still possessed troops that might have slowed the Romans. A counterattack from another section of the line could have changed the pace. The difficulty lay in identifying where the crisis had begun and sending an order that distant units could understand and execute. Tigranes stood in the center as the visible head of the army, but visibility was not the same as control. He could not instantly redirect every contingent near the hill. Lucullus had created a battle that moved faster than the Armenian chain of command. The Roman army's small size had looked like its central weakness. In this moment, it also allowed a tighter connection between what the commander saw and what nearby units did. The same force that would have been vulnerable in a direct struggle could change direction more quickly once an opportunity appeared. The retreat of the cataphracts therefore changed more than one wing. It changed how the rest of the field understood the battle. Armenian infantry no longer saw a small Roman army waiting to be surrounded. They saw their own elite cavalry moving back into them. Once that impression spread, the question was no longer how Tigranes would use superior numbers. It was whether any commander could prevent the army from believing that defeat had already begun. The rout at Tigranocerta later became famous as one of Rome's most dramatic victories over a numerically superior enemy. Ancient accounts pushed the contrast to an extreme, claiming that the Romans faced more than 20 times their number and suffered almost no losses while killing many thousands. Those totals cannot be treated as measured records. Casualty figures after an ancient pursuit were rarely complete, and Roman writers had a clear interest in magnifying the victory. The scale of the defeat is not in doubt. The precise arithmetic is. The speed of the collapse is better explained through cohesion. Tigranes had assembled troops from several regions and deployed them across a wide front. Their strength depended on units holding position and responding to a common plan. Once cavalry from the wing moved into the infantry, that plan stopped functioning. Some soldiers probably tried to stand. Others attempted to move around the congestion. Units farther away received partial or contradictory information. What followed was not an organized withdrawal, but a general loss of direction. Roman infantry was well suited to exploit that change. Cohorts could continue moving in smaller bodies without waiting for the entire line to reform. Centurions maintained control at the local level, and soldiers who had campaigned together understood how to pursue without immediately abandoning all order. Roman cavalry joined the pursuit. Though the evidence does not support a detailed reconstruction of a perfect encirclement, once the Armenian army began to break, mounted troops could threaten fugitives, cut across routes, and prevent some groups from gathering again. The terrain may have intensified the disorder. A large force trying to leave through limited spaces placed pressure on itself from behind. Men dropped equipment to move faster. Horses, wagons, attendants, and soldiers competed for the same routes. The baggage that had made the army look even larger before the battle now obstructed its retreat. Tigranes escaped from the field. Later tradition preserved stories about the royal diadem being removed, lost, or handed away during the flight so that the king would not be recognized. The exact scene is uncertain. What matters is that the ruler who had entered the battle at the center of an immense host left with that army no longer under his command. Mithridates had not arrived in time to shape the battle. He had expected Lucullus to act more cautiously and was still moving toward Tigranes when he met fugitives. The two kings later came together and began planning further resistance. Their meeting makes clear that the war did not end at Tigranocerta. Tigranes had lost the field army and would soon lose the capital, but he still controlled the Armenian heartland and retained the ability to raise troops. Mithridates remained free. Lucullus had won a remarkable battle without capturing the man whose flight had brought him into Armenia. The political effects were immediate in the southern empire. Tigranes' authority had rested for years on repeated success. A public rout near his own capital weakened the fear and confidence that held dependent rulers to him. Neutrality, local independence, or an approach to Rome now seemed less dangerous than before. Diversity, which had displayed the reach of the King of Kings before the battle, became a source of blame afterward. A ruler who had sent cavalry could accuse the central command. A city that had paid tribute could decide to withhold the next payment. Titles could not quickly restore prestige once the army behind them had been seen in flight. The Romans experienced the opposite shift. Soldiers who had entered Armenia, far from secure support, now watched a larger host break before them. Their confidence in Lucullus rose, and the wealth of the royal capital appeared close at hand. The victory also opened a disagreement that would become more serious later. Lucullus viewed Tigranocerta as one stage in a continuing war. Many soldiers could reasonably believe that they had already done enough. Every march after the battle would increase the distance between those two judgments. For the moment, the pursuit continued. Roman troops collected prisoners and took possession of abandoned equipment. The coalition that had filled the landscape no longer behaved as a common army. An army does not have to lose most of its soldiers before it ceases to exist. It collapses when the relationships that make collective action possible are broken. Once units stop receiving shared orders, and men move primarily for personal survival, the military structure has failed even if many individuals remain alive. That was Lucullus's decisive achievement. He did not destroy every contingent Tigranes had summoned. He broke the formation in which the king's authority had assembled them. The survivors scattered, and Tigranocerta was left without the relief its defenders had expected. The defeat outside the city changed conditions inside Tigranocerta before the Romans launched another major assault. The defenders had expected the king's arrival to end the siege. Instead, they saw fugitives leaving the battlefield and learned that the army gathered to rescue them had broken. The city then divided from within. Greek inhabitants are said to have risen against other defenders and helped open the way for Lucullus. No surviving account gives a reliable sequence of the fighting at the gates or identifies every group involved. The broad outcome is clear. Internal conflict delivered Tigranocerta after the field army failed. Forced resettlement helps explain why loyalties changed so quickly. Many residents had been brought from Cappadocia, Cilicia, and other conquered regions. Houses and commercial opportunities in a wealthy capital did not erase the loss of their former communities. Once the monarchy could no longer provide protection, obedience offered less practical benefit. The garrison faced a different decision. Soldiers could continue resisting and hope that Tigranes would gather another army, but nothing visible suggested that relief was near. Walls can remain defensible after a field defeat, yet defenders still need a reason to believe that holding them will improve their position. Tigranocerta contained groups with different expectations, and the battle removed the expectation that had kept them together. Lucullus entered the city and took possession of the royal treasury. Ancient reports give immense sums and describe unusually large payments to individual soldiers. The numbers cannot be audited, but the capture clearly produced exceptional wealth. The city was also plundered. Roman narratives often praise Lucullus for restraint, while accepting looting as the customary reward of victory. For the residents, the distinction was limited. Property was seized, buildings were entered, and a capital created from earlier conquests now experienced conquest itself. The release of forcibly transferred communities could be described as an act of restoration. Many people were allowed to return to the regions from which Tigranes had moved them, and some assistance was provided for the journey. The policy benefited those who wanted to leave, but it also served Roman strategy. Reducing the population weakened Tigranocerta as an imperial centre. Returning people to Cappadocia and Cilicia strengthened districts more closely connected with Roman power. Mercy and calculation operated together. The theatre, prepared for a royal celebration, became part of Roman victory festivities. Performers gathered for the dedication of Tigranes' capital now appeared in games held by Lucullus. The reversal appealed to later writers because the king's cultural display had been turned into evidence of his defeat. Tigranocerta did not vanish immediately. The city continued in some form, though its later history is difficult to trace because the site remains uncertain and several places carried similar names. What ended was its brief claim to stand at the centre of a rapidly expanding empire. The fall exposed the limits of monumental power. Palaces, theatres, and walls could display royal authority while the political system remained stable. They could not create attachment among populations moved by force, and they could not replace an army once its command had collapsed. For Lucullus, the capture solved several immediate problems. The treasury provided money, stores and surrounding districts offered supplies. Rulers and communities that had hesitated now had reasons to seek Roman favour. A campaign that had begun as a dangerous extension beyond the Euphrates seemed to have opened the southern Armenian Empire to Roman influence. The result was still incomplete. Mithridates had not been captured, and Tigranes had not submitted. Both kings could continue resistance farther north, where climate, terrain, and distance would make Roman operations more difficult. The soldiers entering Tigranocerta saw treasure and a visible reward for years of service. Lucullus saw a base for the next campaign. With every mile he later asked them to march, the difference between those views would become harder to ignore. Tigranocerta destroyed the image of Tigranes as an invincible ruler, but it did not destroy Armenia. A dramatic victory can dominate the surviving story, while leaving the slower political work of war unfinished. Tigranes had built his wider empire during a period of unusual opportunity. Seleucid authority had fragmented. Parthia did not control every western territory firmly, and Roman involvement in the region remained uneven. Cities and small kingdoms accepted Armenian supremacy because it offered order, because it brought advantage, or because resistance appeared impossible. After the battle, those calculations shifted. Southern territories could detach themselves with less fear of immediate punishment from the army that had just been defeated. Local rulers approached Lucullus, while some communities restored earlier dynasties or sought Roman recognition. The empire began to contract toward its Armenian core. The political effect exceeded the losses on the battlefield because much of Tigranes' authority was indirect. Tribute and military service moved upward through relationships with local kings and governors. During expansion, this system allowed the crown to control wide areas without building a uniform administration. After a public defeat, the same flexibility made withdrawal easier. Loyalty based on advantage could disappear as quickly as it had formed. The loss of Tigranocerta also damaged revenue. The city concentrated treasure, population, and commercial activity, and its capture gave Rome a stronger position along the roads of northern Mesopotamia. Communities that had once feared Armenian retaliation could now negotiate with the Romans more openly. The empire did not split along a simple religious or cultural line. Iranian royal traditions, Armenian dynastic authority, Greek urban life, and local practices had coexisted under Tigranes. Defeat did not trigger a single religious uprising. It weakened central protection, allowing local interests to become more important. Within Armenia itself, the king's position rested on deeper foundations. Armenian nobles had reasons to preserve the monarchy, and the country north of Tigranocerta offered stronger defensive conditions. A Roman army moving toward Artaxata would face greater distance, colder weather, and fewer friendly cities. Mithridates also became more useful after the defeat. Before Tigranocerta, He had been the refugee, and Tigranes the stronger monarch. Now his experience of recovering from disaster mattered. The two kings could rely on mobility, avoid the kind of set battle Lucullus wanted, and draw the Romans into harsher country. The victory therefore contained the beginnings of Lucullus's later difficulty. Speed and concentration had carried him to Tigranocerta. Continuing north would stretch supply and test soldiers already tired of campaigning. The farther the army moved from the captured capital, the less that victory could support the next operation. Politics in Rome added pressure. Lucullus's enemies accused him of extending the war for glory or profit, and his earlier measures in Asia had angered influential financiers. Within the army, rumours spread that the command would continue indefinitely, perhaps even into Parthia. Battlefield success gave Lucullus authority, but soldiers expected reward and an endpoint. The treasure from Tigranocerta made them richer, while reducing their willingness to accept further hardship. Men who believed they had defeated the King of Kings could also believe that their obligation had been fulfilled. Tigranes, meanwhile, could present continued resistance as the defence of Armenia, rather than the preservation of a southern empire. The loss narrowed his ambitions, but clarified his immediate purpose. He no longer had to recover every dependent kingdom. He had to prevent Lucullus from reaching the old centre of Armenian power. Tigranocerta changed the balance without ending the war. Rome had shown that the king's armies could be defeated and his new capital captured. Armenia still possessed the territory, manpower, and political core required to continue. The battle became famous because of the contrast between the two armies. Its deeper significance lay in the contraction of Tigranes' imperial system, a process that unfolded through defections, negotiations, and the gradual retreat of royal authority from territories gained during the previous 2 decades. During the winter after the victory, Lucullus operated in Gordian and received approaches from rulers who had once answered to Tigranes. He also had to consider Parthia. Its king, Euphrates III, watched the conflict from the east and communicated with both sides. Neither Rome nor the Armenian Pontic alliance could assume his support. Lucullus reportedly considered turning against Parthia when he suspected the king of dealing with both camps. His soldiers showed little interest. The episode revealed how far the command had moved from its starting point. A war against Mithridates had expanded into Armenia and now threatened to open another campaign against a major eastern power. In 68 BC, Lucullus marched north toward Artaxata. Tigranes and Mithridates avoided repeating the conditions of Tigranocerta. They used cavalry and local knowledge to trouble the advance, rather than offering the same kind of fixed battle. A clash near the Arsanias ended in another Roman victory, but it did not produce a comparable political collapse. The season then became decisive. Cold weather and difficult conditions strained the army, and the soldiers refused to continue toward Artaxata. Their action is often called mutiny, though it was not immediately an attempt to overthrow Lucullus. They simply would not march farther into the Armenian highlands. Lucullus turned south and captured Nisibis after a siege. The city provided winter quarters, but the campaign had lost momentum. Mithridates used the pause to return to Pontus, recover territory, and defeat Roman forces left in the region. News of those setbacks strengthened Lucullus's opponents at Rome. New laws and appointments reduced his authority, while disputes over terms of service weakened obedience in the army. Personal rivalries among officers added to the difficulty. The problem was no longer tactical imagination. Strategy required troops willing to carry it out. At Tigranocerta, the army had trusted a bold maneuver and won. Later, many of the same soldiers decided that the cost of continuing exceeded what they owed either their commander or the Republic. In 66 BC, Pompey received extraordinary authority under the Lex Manilia and took over the war against Mithridates, as well as the wider settlement of the East. Lucullus returned to Rome, believing that another commander had inherited the results of his campaigns. Pompey eventually ended the political independence of Mithridates' cause. The Pontic king fled toward the Black Sea, and died in 63 BC after rebellion within his own family and kingdom. Tigranes faced pressure from his son, who rebelled and sought outside support. The elder Tigranes submitted to Pompey near Artaxata. In 66 BC, he retained Armenia, but surrendered most of his external conquests, paid a large indemnity, and accepted a relationship with Rome. The settlement confirmed the change that Tigranocerta had begun. The Armenian kingdom survived. The wider empire of the King of Kings did not. Lucullus' achievement should therefore be neither minimized nor treated as complete. He broke the military confidence of the Southern Empire and captured its capital. He could not impose the final settlement because his army, supply position, and political support did not last long enough. Pompey benefited from the resources, alliances, and exhaustion created during Lucullus's command. He also arrived with renewed authority and the freedom to negotiate after years of war had weakened both kings. Roman success emerged from a sequence of campaigns, rather than from one commander acting alone. Lucullus eventually received a triumph after years of delay and political dispute. The procession displayed Eastern treasure, captured cities, and images of defeated rulers. Rome turned a difficult and unfinished series of campaigns into a clear public story. The soldiers who had crossed the Euphrates remembered something less orderly. They had followed Mithridates into Armenia, defeated Tigranes, taken the new capital, marched toward Artaxata, and then refused to go farther. The victory at Tigranocerta remained real. So did the limit they later placed on what that victory required from them. Lucullus returned to Rome with great wealth and a reputation divided between military skill and aristocratic luxury. Later generations remembered his gardens, libraries, and elaborate dinners almost as readily as his campaigns. The contrast suited writers who wanted to turn a successful commander into a lesson about cultivated retirement. Tigranes remained on the Armenian throne until his death in the 50s BC. His submission to Pompey ended the wider empire, but Rome had little reason to remove him completely. Keeping an established king in Armenia avoided a costly occupation and limited the opportunity for Parthia to fill the space. The settlement also showed the durability of Armenian kingship. Tigranes lost Syria and most of the territories acquired during his rise. Yet Armenia itself remained under his rule. The monarchy represented more than the personal success of one ruler, even after his imperial title had lost much of its force. The battle entered Roman memory through accounts written long after the event. Those narratives preserved the main sequence of invasion, siege, maneuver, rout, and capture, but they also shaped it around moral contrasts. Tigranes became the proud monarch who mistook a small army for an embassy. Lucullus became the commander who saw what others could not. Armenian numbers grew enormous, while Roman losses became almost impossibly small. These contrasts made the story memorable. They also require caution. The likely course of the battle can be explained without accepting the highest figures, or every polished speech. Lucullus faced a larger coalition army and avoided a direct attack on its full front. His movement along the river was interpreted as retreat. After crossing, he turned toward the height and threatened the armoured cavalry from an unfavourable direction. The cavalry withdrew into nearby infantry, and disorder spread faster than the Armenian command could restore cohesion. This explanation does not require Armenian soldiers to be cowardly or Roman troops to possess superhuman discipline. It requires two different military organizations placed under unequal pressure. The Romans had a smaller force with recent shared experience and a commander controlling the immediate maneuver. Tigranes had a larger coalition arranged for a battle that did not develop as expected. Terrain shaped the options. The river and high ground influenced movement, while Roman supply weakness made delay a possible Armenian weapon. Political pressure to relieve Tigranocerta made that delay costly. The forced transfer of population into the capital weakened attachment to the regime. When the field army failed, Tigranes made his decision with the information available to him. He saw a much smaller enemy near his capital. while his own army included respected cavalry and numerous allied contingents. A victory promised to restore order quickly. Avoiding battle risked the city and the loyalty of dependent rulers. The choice was dangerous, but it was not simply irrational. Lucullus also acted under uncertainty. A failed river crossing could have destroyed the Roman army. A counterattack during the climb might have isolated the cohorts near the height. The siege force behind him remained exposed. His plan succeeded because timing, training, and Armenian interpretation aligned during a brief part of the day. The consequences escaped the control of both commanders. Tigranes lost the political structure of his wider empire, but kept his kingdom. Lucullus gained wealth and fame, but could not persuade his army to finish the war. Pompey later received the authority needed to turn years of campaigning into a settlement. Tigranocerta was therefore a decisive battle inside an unfinished campaign. It changed what rulers in the region believed possible, by showing that the army of the King of Kings could be broken near his own capital. Subject territories reconsidered their loyalties, and Rome gained access to influence and wealth beyond the Euphrates. The result also exposed the limits of military spectacle. A crowded battlefield could conceal weak coordination. While the capture of a capital did not secure the rulers who had defended it, the triumph, eventually celebrated in Rome, concealed the negotiation, exhaustion, and refusal required to turn victory into political control. After the fighting, the landscape remained. Rivers still crossed the southern approaches to Armenia, and roads still linked Mesopotamia with the highlands. Tigranocerta continued to exist in some form, even as later generations lost certainty about its location. The clearest legacy lay in the altered balance of power. Before 69 BC, Tigranes could claim a realm stretching toward both the Caspian and the Mediterranean. After the battle, he fought to preserve the Armenian core. Before the invasion, Mithridates had used Armenia as a place of refuge. Afterward, the two kings depended on one another against a Roman advance they could no longer dismiss. Lucullus had crossed the Euphrates to prevent an old enemy from rebuilding once again. Beyond the river he found a larger kingdom, forced it into battle, and broke the political confidence on which its expansion depended. Resistance continued for years. The empire of Tigranes, however, had stopped growing and begun to come apart.